On Thursday, April the 4th, 1974, I was in the passenger seat of my dad's Volkswagen Beetle, and we were driving home from my nephew's birthday party. It started to rain, and then it rained more, and it got darker and darker. Now, I started to get a little scared with this wind, and then it picked up, and there was more wind and more noise, and the car shook. Now, I know that the VW Beetle looked sweet, but it was not the most bad weather sturdy car that was made back then. So it was pretty harrowing. And then I looked up and saw something that kind of looked like this. I was terrified. I thought I was going to die that day. When we got home, we immediately went into our basement and we stayed there all night. Now, I could hear crashing and rain and the rain hitting the windows. And at one point, it felt like the whole house was going to shake off of its foundation and come down around us. I was terrified for my life. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, safe, sound. It was later that I learned that April the 4th was, at the time, one of the worst tornado outbreaks in the history of the United States. 71 people died in Kentucky alone that night, and hundreds more around the country. Have you ever feared for your actual life? Maybe not many of us have had a near-death experience, or one at least that we care to recount and relive. But have you ever felt that sense of horror or shock or panic, even desperation? That is where we find the Israelites this morning. Last week, we started with the inciting incident of the slavery of Israel. Pharaoh, now, as we move forward into the story, the Pharaoh has finally let the Israelites go. After all the plagues, the death of the firstborn in Israel, the Passover, Pharaoh had finally relented and let the Israelites go into the wilderness to worship their God. But then he changes his mind. He has one of those moments that, what was I thinking? Letting those people go, all that free labor? And I hate sheep. Okay, so let's pick up the story in Exodus 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. They did what God asked them to do, but they didn't stay in that following space for very long. In verse 10, it continues, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And so Pharaoh gathers his chariots and his officers and his full army, and he goes after the Israelites. Now, they could see Pharaoh's army approaching from where they had stopped to camp at the edge of the sea, and there was nowhere for them to go. It's a dead end. They will easily be overtaken. They're trapped. Their backs are against the sea. Now, verse 10 says that the Israelites feared greatly, and to be sure, this is a real place of danger and fear. On their own, they would be no match for Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen. They have no resources, no weapons, no hope of success on their own, and they cry out in desperation to Moses. They were saying, "What were you thinking bringing us all the way out here to die? Was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt for all of us?" And then in verse 11, they say, "For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And then in 13 it says, "And Moses said to the people, 'Fear not, stand firm, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.'" Last week we heard Pastor Laura talk about the inciting incident of the Israelites entering into slavery. Today we come to inciting incident number 2. This is where the Israelites are trapped and facing certain death, and they only have God to look to. And Moses responds, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord." The Israelites had 3 complaints. They were met with 3 responses of Moses: do not fear, stand, and see. Verse 13 refocuses the Israelites on God and God's presence and action to stop, pay attention, and then to notice a presence in their crisis that they had failed to notice or acknowledge even before. Moses reframes the crisis of Israel around the presence, power, and the fidelity of Yahweh. These simple words, these brief instructions completely reframe the crisis. You see, up until this point, God hasn't even been mentioned in this section of the story. The Israelites don't even perceive God to be an active character here. Even after all those plagues, no. They look to Moses and complain to him. They question his leadership, his discernment. They say, "Really? This was your idea?" To them, it was a leadership crisis, nothing involving God. The name of Pharaoh is referred to multiple times in this section. Because remember, that's the name they knew. That's the name of their familiar place, their place of safety and comfort. Even though it was in bondage, they at least knew what to expect. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than it would be to die in the wilderness. But Moses draws their attention back to God. Moses' instructions introduce God as the acting character here, each one pointing them to the awesomeness of God, to the awareness of God's presence and power for them. He said, "Do not fear." That's a characteristic beginning of a salvation story or divine encounter. Stand firm in the promises of God for us and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. A stop, look, and listen of sorts. A call to stillness, a call to an awareness of the presence of God, even as their death seems imminent. It was a call to faith. This won't be the last time the Israelites doubt Moses' leadership or God's presence with them. We will see that in the coming weeks for sure. But it seems this whole episode is a setup for God to get the glory over Pharaoh. A clash of these sovereignties and powers, so that Israel and Egypt will see that Yahweh is the Lord over all. And that for Israel, this God is a God who can be trusted. Remember, in 14:4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Now, this is an exercise that will move Israel from a place of fear and doubt through a place of stillness before God's power and presence, and ultimately to a place of trust and worship. Now, the story continues in verse 15. Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. The people of Israel are going to be able to go through the sea on dry ground, and I'm going to take care of Pharaoh by hardening the hearts of all the Egyptians so that they'll go after you, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts. The Egyptians are going to know that I'm God. That's what he says. He says, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So then Moses stretches out his hands over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong wind all night long, made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on this dry ground, the waters being a wall on either side. So it's kind of like walking down a hallway. To the left and the right, there's water. Now, it also goes on to say that there was this pillar of cloud. It was actually the very presence of God that went through the camps, between the camps and between the tents, and protected the Israelites while Moses stretched out his hand. The waters were divided. Dry ground emerged, and the Israelites safely passed through the wall with waters on either side. It was an act as powerful as that image from creation when God parted the waters and the dry land emerged. And for the Israelites, it would become this metaphor for their recreation, their new birth, as they passed through these waters from a place of captivity to a place of redemption, to freely worship God as the chosen people of God. Walter Brueggemann says that in this moment of liberation, God seems to do a deed as powerful, original, and life-giving as the very newness of creation. God fought for them, clogged up the wheels and sending their chariots into panic. Their horses are going nuts and instructing Moses to extend his hand again, bring the waters back down all over the Egyptians and upon the chariots and on their horsemen. And verse 30 says, thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. The lesson of faith that the Israelites learn here is to stop, look, and listen for the presence of the Lord. Even when they were entrapped on all sides, the Lord will make a way for them when there is no way. They learn to move from this place of danger to a place of trust in God's power and provision through their awareness and stillness of God's presence with them. And their fear was transformed. This is a God who is present with his people. This is a God who fights for them. This is a God who can be trusted. And in 1431, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. The fear they had for their lives became fear in God, a reverence, an awe, a wonder that led them to worship, an awe that was a different kind of fear. It was fear, but in this instance, fear means an overwhelming feeling of reverence, admiration, or fear produced by that which is grand or extremely powerful. In order to be in pure awe of something, you have to take in its magnitude and its power and the greatness in regard to little old me. Like me being in awe of that tornado so many years ago. There was an awe and a fear and a wonder in also knowing that the storm was powerful enough to take one's life. Now, they saw the Lord's power. They saw the Lord's victory over the Egyptians, and they were moved to awe and wonder. They feared God in a new way from this position of belief and faith in this powerful God. Now, we see a similar fear transformed for the disciples later on in the Gospels. Right after Jesus calls them to be his disciples in the Gospel of Matthew, they board a boat. They head out across the Sea of Galilee to continue on his mission. As they cross, a storm comes up over top of them. They got in his boat, the disciples following him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went to him and they woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he rose, he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds of the sea obey him?" A friend of mine went on a trip to the Holy Land a couple of years ago now. And when they were in the region, they took a boat tour of this same area, this same place. It looked kind of like this. It's really no bigger than a small lake. You could see all the way across it in one look. Sort of unimpressive, really, from the great sea and the storm that we imagine in the scriptures. But the lake is also surrounded by mountains. And the guide told them that storms could come up on the body of water rather quickly, and rolling in over the mountains and then down into the valley, they became very powerful storms. Winds can rage and waves can get 5 to 6 feet high. 5 to 6 feet high. Think about that for a minute. So that must have been rather alarming, I would think, especially in a small fishing boat. Either way, the disciples in this story felt real danger and fear. And they make a similar move. Once they see Jesus' power over the natural waters, once they seek his presence and cry out to him, they already believe that he could help them. I mean, the Israelites didn't really believe that at that point, but they knew at least that he could. Their fear is transformed to wonder and awe. The Gospel of Luke said that they feared and they marveled. What sort of man is this that can even the winds and sea obey him? And this is the Lord of creation. The same God who fought for Israel, the same God who parted the waters, and now the same God now among them who calms the storm in the sea. This is a God who can be trusted and one they can follow into an unknown journey of discipleship. At some point throughout the last year, you probably found yourself in a similar place of danger or fear, maybe disoriented by the isolation or the concerns about your health or the well-being of someone you love or a friend. And yet, our God is a God who comes to be with us, who is literally in the same boat as us. And when we seek his presence, that fear can be transformed. As we move from stillness and awareness of the presence of God, we look to the one who does save. Our fear can be transformed into wonder and awe and worship. Now, the fear doesn't go away. It doesn't mask a lack of faith or belief or doubt, only a need to reorient the crisis back to the ever presence of God. Stop, stand firm, see the salvation of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you. You only have to remain still. That is the place of trust. That is the face of peace. Even in the middle of the chaos, the story, the wilderness, messy middle of the story, when the chaos is all around you, the truth that Jesus the Christ is right there with us through it all